Imagine your limbs pinned down while warriors laugh, tearing flesh from your body, eating it raw while your screams echo under a burning sun. Blood drips from their mouths as they rip away another piece, believing that each bite will steal your courage and bind your spirit to theirs forever. This wasn't a nightmare or some legend to scare children around a fire. This was real. Across the world, warlords have eaten their enemies alive, not out of hunger, but as a show of dominance, to terrify rivals into submission, to take spiritual power, or to send a message that defiance would lead to a death worse than death itself. Flesh torn while hearts still beat, blood swallowed while eyes still blink in horror. Tonight, we will walk through history's darkest moments, from the cannibal kings of Fiji to the Aztec priests on their temple steps, the warlords of the Congo and the Highland tribes of Papua New Guinea. We will see why these men chose to consume their enemies, what it meant for those who witnessed it, and how the taste of human fear and flesh became the ultimate symbol of power in a world where violence was law. History is dark, and tonight, we will remember it. Throughout history, eating your enemies wasn't just about flesh, it was about power. In many tribal warfare cultures, cannibalism was a ritual drenched in blood and fear, believed to absorb the mana, the life force, of the enemy. By consuming a rival's flesh, a warrior could claim their strength, courage and spirit, ensuring the fallen would serve the victor in the afterlife, or that their own power would grow with every bite. It was also a symbol of absolute domination. Killing an enemy was not enough. Eating them meant destroying them completely, humiliating them, erasing their identity, and proving to your people that you were fearless, merciless, and worthy of leadership. It was a message carved in screams and blood that survival in this world meant understanding fear and making others fear you. This was not isolated to one corner of the world. The Fijian war chiefs roasted the limbs of captured warriors, believing each piece they swallowed secured their rule. The Maori of New Zealand saw cannibalism as Utu, a means to settle scores and avenge wrongs, ensuring the enemy's life force was taken forever. In the Congo, tribal conflicts sometimes ended with victors eating the hearts of enemies as a declaration that the spirit of the fallen now served the living. The Aztecs, on their sun-baked temples, tore out beating hearts, and while they more commonly offered the flesh to the gods, there are accounts of rulers and warriors consuming pieces to absorb sacred energy. Among some Papuan Highland tribes, consuming enemies was a dark ritual, a celebration of victory and a curse upon the defeated, ensuring they would never return to seek vengeance. This was a darkness rooted in survival, fear, and spiritual belief. To these warlords and warriors, eating an enemy was the final conquest, turning their flesh into nourishment, their spirit into submission, and their screams into silence forever. They called it the Cannibal Isles for a reason. On the lush, green islands of Fiji, war was not only about who held the club last. It was about who could consume the flesh of their enemies to claim true dominance. Chiefs and warlords believed that the power of a fallen rival was trapped within their body, and to eat that body was to capture the spirit and strength for themselves. Battlefields were followed by feasting grounds. Warriors wielding heavy war clubs would crush skulls and limbs, the red mud mixing with blood, as they dragged the bodies back to the village. Sometimes, prisoners were kept alive, tied to posts, forced to watch the fires being prepared, and to listen to the sharpening of knives, knowing every breath was closer to screams. The butchering was systematic. Flesh was stripped, bones were cracked for marrow, and what could not be cooked immediately was preserved in baskets for the next meal. Clay ovens were dug, fires roaring, as the flesh was wrapped in banana leaves and roasted, the smell of burning fat filling the village, while warriors chanted and drums echoed. To the Fijians, this was not mindless savagery. It was a spiritual duty. It was justice, revenge, and a way to ensure the spirits of the dead served their killers. No figure embodies this darkness more than Ratu Yudra, the most feared cannibal chief in recorded history. It is said that Ratu Yudra ate over 800 human bodies, keeping a stone for each victim as a tally of his conquest and hunger. Some stories say his enemies were thrown at his feet alive, their limbs hacked off, while he chewed on their flesh to break their will before death came. Others claim he would eat alongside his warriors, encouraging them to swallow the flesh of the fallen as a sacred bond of loyalty and terror. Visitors who came to Fiji during this era described seeing baskets filled with cooked human flesh, bones scattered under raised huts, and warriors sharpening knives with casual indifference while blood dried on their arms. Heads were sometimes preserved, mouths twisted in final screams, as warnings to anyone who dared challenge the chief's rule. For the Fijian warlords, cannibalism was not simply brutality, it was a tool of political control, spiritual dominance, and fear. It was a declaration to their enemies that defeat did not mean death alone. It meant eternal submission, your body devoured, your spirit enslaved, and your legacy erased under the teeth of those who conquered you. On these islands, the power of the chiefs was measured not just in warriors and weapons, but in the flesh they consumed and the fear they commanded. To be eaten alive, piece by piece, by those you once fought, was the ultimate humiliation, and the Fijian warlords wielded that terror like a blade. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, where towering temples scraped the sky and blood stained the stone steps, the Aztec priests and warlords used cannibalism as a tool of terror, religion, and power. Captured warriors were dragged up the pyramid, flutes and drums echoing across the city as the people gathered below. The victims, painted and adorned for sacrifice, knew they were not just going to die, they were going to be torn apart and devoured, and the very people who conquered them. On the altar, a priest with an obsidian blade would cut open the chest, rip out the beating heart, and hold it to the sun while blood poured down the steps in dark rivers. But the sacrifice did not end with the heart. Flesh was carved from the body, carefully divided among the priests, nobles, and warriors who participated in the capture. Arms, thighs, and even the cheeks were cooked with maize and peppers, turned into sacred stews shared among the elite. In the court of Montezuma II, the last emperor before the Spanish conquest, ritual feasting on human flesh was not hidden. It was performed with ceremony and pride. To consume the flesh of the enemy was to absorb their bravery, their spirit, and to feed the gods who demanded constant nourishment to keep the world alive. The more enemies sacrificed and consumed, the more powerful the empire appeared, and the more fear it commanded among neighboring tribes. There are Spanish accounts describing markets in Tenochtitlan where body parts were sold, prepared for consumption like cuts of pork, displayed alongside fruits, vegetables, and maize. Travelers and invaders wrote of seeing cages filled with prisoners waiting for sacrifice, knowing their flesh would end up in the cooking pots of priests and nobles, turned into tamales shared during sacred feasts. The Aztecs did not see this as cruelty, but as necessity and honor. It was the natural cycle of war: conquer, sacrifice, consume. The body of a fallen warrior was a final tribute to the gods and a testament to the victor's power. For the warlords and priests, cannibalism was control. It showed absolute dominance over the conquered, turning their bodies into nourishment, while their spirits were offered to the sun, moon, and gods who ruled every moment of Aztec life. Those who watched from below saw what awaited them if they dared to rebel. Fear, power, and faith were all bound in the flesh torn from the bodies of captives. Every bite was a message: the empire devours those who defy it, and even in death, the conquered serve the will of their victors. In the dense rainforests of Central Africa, where mist clings to the trees and drums echo through the night, warlords and kings once devoured the flesh of their enemies to claim power, fear, and spiritual dominance. Long before colonial borders carved up the land, tribal conflicts across the Congo basin were marked by ritual cannibalism, a practice that was not mindless brutality, but a deeply rooted spiritual belief. To consume an enemy was to absorb their life force, their strength, their courage. When warriors captured an enemy on the battlefield, the body was not simply discarded. In some tribes, the heart, liver, and vital organs were removed and consumed by chiefs, war leaders, or spiritual healers, believing these parts contained the essence of the fallen. Eating the flesh was not only an act of total victory, but a way to ensure that the spirit of the enemy would serve the victor, empowering him in future battles. There were kings who believed that to rule effectively, they must feed on the bodies of those who defied them. They would host feasts after victory, where the meat of a fallen rival was prepared, sometimes boiled with plantains and spices, and shared among loyal warriors to bind them together in blood and fear. Among the Mbandi Azandi and other groups in the region, cannibalism became an unspoken rule of conquest. It was both punishment and ritual. An enemy who dared to fight back would not only lose his life, but would be devoured, ensuring his soul would forever be enslaved to his conqueror. Witnesses described limbs hacked off, while the victim still screamed, to be cooked while the heart was still beating, and the elders chanting incantations to capture the spirit. The eyes and heart were especially prized, believed to give the consumer the vision and courage of the fallen. In these societies, cannibalism was deeply tied to power. It created fear among rivals, loyalty among warriors who shared in the feast, and spiritual assurance for the warlords who believed they were chosen by ancestral spirits to rule through dominance. It was a psychological weapon, as much as a physical act of cruelty. When European colonizers arrived in the 19th century, they were horrified by these stories, using them to justify brutal interventions. Yet, for centuries before, the act of consuming an enemy was seen by many warlords as a rightful conclusion to war, a final humiliation for the defeated, and a final confirmation of power for the victor. In the shadows of the rainforest, among flickering fires and war drums, flesh was torn, boiled, and eaten in the belief that power came not just from the sword, but from the body of the conquered, consumed bite by bite until nothing remained but fear. High in the misty mountains of Papua New Guinea, where valleys are cut deep and the jungles swallow entire villages, cannibal warlords ruled with sharpened spears and the hunger for human flesh. Among many highland tribes, warfare and cannibalism were not separate acts, but part of the same ritual of dominance. When tribal conflict erupted, warriors painted themselves in ash and clay, raiding neighboring villages at dawn, leaving huts burning and bodies scattered across the muddy ground. The fallen were not left for the pigs. They were dragged back, limbs hacked off, flesh prepared over open fires while warriors chanted war songs, and the scent of cooking human meat mingled with the smoke of victory. Cannibal feasting was often tied to peace negotiations, with a final act of consuming an enemy to seal the humiliation of the defeated and prove the absolute authority of the victors. In these highlands, cannibalism was not mindless savagery, but a methodical way to humiliate rival clans. A mother's grief was magnified, knowing that her son's flesh was being eaten, ensuring that even in death, the victim's body served the conqueror's power. The warriors believed that by eating the flesh of their enemies, they were consuming the strength, courage, and mana of the fallen, a spiritual absorption that would make them stronger for future conflicts. The hearts, livers, and sometimes even brains were considered the most sacred parts, boiled with taro and yams, eaten in silence or with war chants under torchlight. Stories from 19th and early 20th century explorers describe stumbling upon heaps of human bones, charred skulls, and blood-stained cooking stones in abandoned villages, evidence of the feasting that had occurred days before. Missionaries and colonial officers reported entire raids ending with young warriors dancing around fires while older men prepared the flesh. Each bite a reminder of tribal supremacy. Some tribes believed that failing to consume the enemy was a sign of weakness, inviting future attacks. The act of cannibalism became a psychological barrier, ensuring that enemies would twice before seeking revenge, knowing that defeat meant not just death, but the desecration of their bodies in the most intimate, horrifying way possible. In these high valleys where the clouds roll in low and thick, war and feasting blurred, and the human body became the final trophy in a brutal system of tribal justice. Cannibalism was a reminder that in the raw edges of human history, power was taken not just by bloodshed, but by consuming the flesh of those who dared to resist. In the lush green valleys and rugged coastlines of New Zealand, the Maori once waged wars that were as much about manner and honor as they were about land and survival. But beneath the haka chants and the spiraling tattoos lay a brutal reality. Cannibalism was part of the battlefield, a ritual act meant to break enemies and empower the victors. When tribal warfare erupted, enemy chiefs were captured alive, beaten, humiliated, and then prepared for the final act. They were killed and cooked in hangi pits, underground ovens lined with hot stones. The flesh was wrapped in leaves, steaming beneath the earth as warriors sharpened their weapons and prepared for the feast that would follow. Cannibalism among the Maori was not simply about hunger. It was about psychological warfare. Eating the flesh of an enemy, especially a rival chief, was the ultimate insult, a statement that their mana, their spiritual authority, was now consumed by the victors. Warriors would taunt the bodies as they cooked, chanting insults, laughing, and reminding the defeated tribe that their leaders were now food. There are accounts of warriors eating the heart of a slain enemy to gain their courage, believing the act would transfer the strength of the fallen into their own veins. The liver, considered a powerful organ, was also eaten to absorb the mana of the dead. Survivors of these raids would be forced to watch as their fathers, brothers, and chiefs were butchered and consumed, the smell of cooking flesh mixing with the smoke of burned villages. This was a form of psychological terror. The ultimate defeat was not death itself, but the desecration and consumption of your body by those you had once opposed. European explorers and missionaries in the 18th and early 19th centuries were horrified, reporting scenes of freshly killed enemies, dismembered on the battlefield, with body parts carried away for feasting. The Maori themselves viewed it as a necessary part of warfare, a sacred ritual ensuring the mana of the fallen returned to the victors. For the Maori, cannibalism was never random savagery, but a structured part of tribal justice and honor, reminding every tribe that defeat meant more than loss of land or life. It meant being consumed, your spirit devoured along with your flesh, ensuring that even in death, you served the tribe that defeated you. In these wars, eating your enemy's heart was not a metaphor. It was the final act of conquest, a dark reminder that in the history of human warfare, the battlefield does not end at death, and power can be claimed even in the flesh of your enemies. Across cultures where cannibal warlords ruled, the fear of being eaten alive was a weapon in itself. Victims often begged for death in battle rather than capture, for they knew capture meant torture, humiliation, and a slow death that ended with their bodies consumed. The psychological terror did not stop at physical pain. In many of these societies, there was a spiritual dread tied to cannibalism. People believed that if their bodies were eaten, their spirits would become enslaved to the one who consumed them. Their mana, their essence, would be trapped forever, powerless, forced to serve the victor even in death. Witnesses, often family members or fellow villagers, were forced to watch loved ones butchered and eaten. The sounds of screams and the tearing of flesh echoing in the air, while the smell of blood and smoke filled the village. The psychological scars of witnessing such horror destroyed communities, leaving behind generations afraid to fight back. Haunted by the images of their fathers and brothers torn apart, their bodies devoured by the conquerors. The warlords who practiced cannibalism understood this terror. They knew that by consuming their enemies, they were not only taking life, but crushing the will of entire tribes, ensuring submission through fear that was more potent than any weapon. For those who fell into the hands of cannibal warlords, the final moments were a descent into horror, with the mind breaking long before the body did, and death becoming a twisted mercy in a world where even in death, your conqueror could claim you, piece by piece. When European explorers and missionaries first arrived in regions ruled by cannibal warlords, stories of human flesh roasting over fires and bodies hacked apart were carried back to Europe. These tales became the stuff of nightmares, filling colonial writings with exaggerated claims meant to justify conquest and civilizing missions. But buried beneath the colonial propaganda were real practices. Missionaries and explorers found charred bones, skull racks, and cannibal pits, confirming that in many tribal conflicts, cannibalism was not merely myth, but a ritual part of war and punishment. Missionaries documented negotiations to end cannibalism, offering steel tools, cloth, and protection in exchange for the cessation of ritual feasting. Yet the tension between reality and exaggeration remained. Some colonial powers used tales of cannibalism to dehumanize entire peoples, while others found themselves shocked to see these practices firsthand. The truth is that cannibal warlords did exist, and they did eat their enemies to display power and to inspire fear. But the colonial world often used these real horrors as tools for their own empire building, overshadowing the complex reasons behind why these societies turned to cannibalism in the first place. In the end, the image of the cannibal warlord became legend, but the bones and burned flesh left behind remain the silent testimony that for many, being eaten alive was not a story, but a terror faced in their final moments. As the missionaries moved deeper into tribal territories and European colonial powers carved up the world, the ancient reign of cannibal warlords began to crumble. Colonial administrations passed harsh laws, declaring cannibalism a crime punishable by death or imprisonment, and tribal leaders were forced to abandon practices that had been central to warfare and spiritual life for generations. Missionaries offered medicine, steel tools, and education in exchange for the end of flesh feasts, and some tribes, exhausted by constant warfare, accepted. Others resisted, practicing cannibalism in secret until it was no longer possible to hide under the watchful eyes of colonial patrols. By the early 20th century, most ritual cannibalism had disappeared from Africa and the Pacific. Yet, in the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea, reports of cannibal raids and feasts continued into the 1950s, with some of the last known documented incidents shocking patrol officers and anthropologists who stumbled upon burned bones and stories whispered by elders. The age of the warlords who ate their enemies alive faded, not because humanity grew less cruel, but because the world changed around them, forcing even the most feared warriors to put down the knife and the fire, leaving behind only stories and scars buried in the soil where the bones of their victims once lay. There is a darkness in humanity that emerges when power, fear, and belief merge into one force. The warlords who feasted on the flesh of their enemies did so not only out of hunger for dominance, but out of a deeper, spiritual terror, a belief that consuming the body meant consuming the soul, that domination could be sealed in blood and bone. For the victims, death was not the end. It was the beginning of a final humiliation, knowing that their bodies would be torn apart and devoured in front of those they once called kin, their spirits enslaved in the belief of those who consumed them. It's easy to look away, to call these stories primitive, monstrous, and distant from the world we know today. But the truth is that history is filled with acts like these, born from fear, power, and desperation. And it is only by remembering them that we keep ourselves from repeating the same darkness under different names. History is dark, and we must remember it.